presentation entitled Gender and Sexual Diversity and Social Work, Critical Liberationist Connections. I was trying this title to kind of connect to the actual theme of the conference, being connecting for Canada's 150th Canadian Visionaries of Critical Social Work. A lot of us who are speaking over the weekend were joking about that term. We don't quite see ourselves as visionaries or as experts per se, but as eternal students, in essence, constantly learning. And so what I'll be focusing on, and I'll explain this a bit, is why I use the term gender and sexual diversity, and making that connection to critical social work. I come from the critical school of thought in my work, and I will also be sharing with you some theory development that I'm engaged in when it comes to my work in the liberationist perspective. Here we are. So you can see I have a lot to talk about, and I'm going to do my best to get through it in 40 minutes or so, and I think it's wonderful that clock is positioned right there, so I can keep my eye on that. So like most people, I'm going to start off with some terminology in terms of some terms that I tend to use based on the arguments that I have formed, as well as terminology that you may be familiar with in the literature or in practice, and terminology you may not be as familiar with, and I can assist with that. I'll move on to intersectionality, a theme that has come up repeatedly in the talks, and because it is so important in the work that we do. And from there, I will share in kind of one slide an overview of some theory development work that I'm working on right now. It's a bit dense, but it will hopefully capture what I'm basing my work on, that I've entitled Queer Liberation Theory. I'll look at some of the practical implications of applying that theory, if indeed get that theory out at some point. And then from there, the macro social welfare structure and where gender and sexual diversity fits into that, or not for that matter. Then it's always important, I always feel, as a foundational piece to look at the importance of principles and ethics, and how that applies with regard to these populations and specifically to social work as a discipline. And then I'll move on to part of my argument in theory development is the division between legal and social justice. And I'll explain that a bit further and what's involved with that. Then I'll look at the social needs of the populations I'm looking at. I will have a bit of a critique about Canada's 150th birthday/anniversary, and providing you with a bit of a homonationalist narrative with regard to that. And I will then move beyond Canada and look a little bit at the international perspective of the gender and sexually diverse, critical social work and social justice, and how the two connect, before looking at strategies for change within our discipline, and then continuing challenges that we still face, despite the progress that has been made in these communities, and ongoing social justice work. Before I conclude, just contact information if you want to discuss any of this further with me. So in terms of terminology, I think most people do recognize what a lot of these groups represent within the broader umbrella of the really tedious and cumbersome acronym of LGBTQ2SIQ, right? And I'm going to try to avoid saying that for the presentation, otherwise I'll be here all day repeating that, because it is quite cumbersome. And that's not meaning to offend anyone who may identify with any of those. I think when we really try hard to be inclusive, sometimes we get monotonous about it. And in essence, I'm talking about the lesbian, gay, bisexual, transsexual, transgender, two-spirit, intersex, and queer communities. And when we get to the second point, that's the terminology I tend to use in my writings and has been used a lot in literature. It's a means of kind of an umbrella term that encapsulates these populations at once. And that is the gender and sexually diverse, a broad means of capturing those whom we recognize outside heterosexuality and cisgenderism, and those we have yet to recognize. People are familiar with cisgenderism. No? Okay, so that is when an individual sticks to the sex that they were assigned at birth. So if your sex is female and you were assigned as female at birth, baby girl, and you stick with that through your life, then you are cisgendered. Right? If you choose to change your sex, then you would not be cisgendered if you were to transition. Queer, in particular, I'm going to highlight this term in my use of this term, and of course it can be used in many ways, and as we've already heard, I think Brenda mentioned this in her talk yesterday, this is a reclamation term. We've reclaimed this term. It was normally used as a derogatory one in the past, and many of us have reclaimed it. I take it a bit further and I use it as a politicized term. I'm not the only one, but not everyone does necessarily. But I see it as a politicized term that relates to a more progressive, sex-positive perspective that embraces diversity over assimilation. So in essence, those of us who identify as queer are very proud to be different. We're not interested in assimilating to what everyone else wants or expects of us. And we feel that that difference should be celebrated as something that we contribute to the diversity of society. This is not the case with the broader LGBT2S IQ communities necessarily. And I'll get into that argument shortly when I get into my theory. With regard to intersectionality, sexual orientation, gender identity and expression, and sex characteristics across all sociocultural and economic boundaries. What is represented on the screen is not conclusive and could include other social locations such as ethnicity, disability, indigenous status, etc. Individuals choose which of their social locations they tend to prioritize, and this can vary dependent upon the environments and situations they find themselves in. Taking varying social locations into consideration assists us in understanding that the LGBTQ SIQ communities are not monolithic, and as such, the experiences therein can be highly diversified. How sexual orientation, gender identity, and expression and sex characteristics intersect with other social locations and how individuals assemble their own social makeup is what we as social workers need to be attentive to. And this can vary over time. This can be impacted by comfort levels. So that's just something that we need to tap into just simply by asking and finding out where people locate themselves. And we may get a very unsure response for that matter. And that too is fine. It just speaks to where people are at a certain point in time. Okay, so I'm on to my theoretical slide here. This could be a bit dense, so bear with me as I kind of go through some notes here that relate to the things that are on the screen. And so here, this is where I'm kind of positing a theory that I am distinguishing to some extent from queer theory that has dominated sexuality studies over the last quarter century, I would say. We're about 25 years with this. And I will admit up front, I have never been comfortable with queer theory from the minute I started reading it. But I've also learned not to dismiss it either, because I think there's some real value that theory has brought forward and has challenged us with, particularly around fluidity. But I come from a social activist background, and a lot of us as activists took real offense to that theory that was critical of our work over many years. And so what I'm positing here, and I'm at early to mid stages on this, and hopefully we'll get something out in due time in a more dense way, because some of my more recent writings have just been introducing them. But in any case, it's a little different in the sense that queer theory tends to be anti-identitarian. It eschews identities it's very much based on a postmodernist perspective, drawing very much from Foucault. But one of the issues that a lot of us have at the activist level is how do you affect change if you can't label what you're trying to change, right? And so that's been a real tension between what happens at the ground level with what's going on with queer theory. In terms of liberation, and I should point out I'm drawing from the tenets and principles of the gay liberation movement of the late 1960s, early 1970s, and making links to the current queer liberationist perspective and movement of today, which is a lot more complicated than what things looked like back in the late 60s, early 70s. So that's the work involved in theory development that I'm engaged in. The ethos of liberation begins at the micro level with the individual as the core unit of concern and provides a macro perspective that goes beyond liberating the individual to altering society as a whole for the better. Disrupting the omnipresence of heteronormativity by declaring one's minoritized sexuality. Heteronormativity meaning that heterosexuality dominates in our society and has become normalized. Anyone who's outside of that would be seen as abnormal, per se, or different. Recognizing the importance of identity politics in the powerful act of coming out, particularly for collectivist reasons, yet never losing sight of the multiplicities that make up the gender and sexually diverse communities. And again, the intersectionalities that are involved with that. Winning equality and legal rights are seen as smaller victories on the journey towards the larger goals of transforming the social order and achieving social justice. And I'll get further into that in a future slide with regard to the difference between legal justice and social justice. An analysis of power dynamics recontextualizes all the stakeholders and the kind of society we want to live in. Understanding all of these points is the essence of liberation, the freedom to live our lives as we choose, because so often norms are imposed upon us, and to be truly liberated is not to be restricted by such norms. So, in essence, a critical queer liberation perspective engages in a process of questioning, resisting, and challenging. Resistance to heteronormative socializing and conditioning, a movement towards assimilationism to gain acceptance and respectability is rejected. Challenged are the hegemonic notions that heterosexuality and traditional gender identities and roles are the norm. Queer liberation calls for the creation of a society that is inclusive, respectful, and accepting of the gender and sexually diverse populations as these populations choose to define themselves and their lives. And the difference is right there. That's the crux of the difference. Whereas much of the movement has gone in the direction of seeking acceptance and respect on heterosexual terms, queer liberation says it needs to be on our terms. So that's the real difference that I'm pointing out there. Now, with regard to practical implications, engaging in public education regarding gender and sexual diversity is important. And this has been going on for many years. I mean, we wouldn't be where we are today if this hadn't happened since that period of time of an organized movement of the late 60s, early 70s, right through to now. Ensuring that professional ethics and principles include gender and sexual diversity. Calling for non-discriminatory equity policies that are inclusive of these populations, and urging funding that goes beyond STIs, being sexually transmitted infections, to address the various needs and issues of these populations. And oftentimes we get categorized in that. We find placed in sexuality issues, sexually transmitted infections, and no other issues tend to be looked at. And that's a real undercutting of the experiences of people in these communities. In the absence of any of these, we lack the structural supports to adequately respond to the needs of these populations. And as social workers, we need to be cognizant of this and try to affect change in that area. Every time I look at this slide, I get frustrated because it didn't quite work out the way I had hoped. There are limitations with PowerPoint, so I kind of had to condense healthcare and social services together when they were meant to be separate. This is a bit of a limited slide because there's a lot more. There are a lot more sectors of a broader macro society that could be included here, such as the law, such as religion, the correction system. Many areas that we could be looking at, but I kind of highlighted these ones for now. So this illustrates from a macro perspective the major components that make up the social welfare structure. At a more meso and micro level, work is needed within each of these components to adequately address the welfare needs of gender and sexually diverse. From there, the interconnections between them is what will hold the social welfare system to account. So back when I did my PhD, I looked very much at the healthcare and social services policy system to see to what extent, then I looked at to what extent LGBs were included. I didn't capture the trans population, so that could have been its own thesis all on its own. And of course, it was lacking in the three countries. I did an international comparison. So in the UK, in the US, and Canada, we were all lacking. And some places had some promise, and others had less so. Beyond that, our education system requires a lot of attention to this. And in the last number of years, we've heard about this at the secondary level in Canada with regard to GSAs, the gay-straight alliances that exist in the province I come from. In Ontario, we have a publicly funded Catholic school board system that to this day refuses to allow any GSAs to exist. And this is despite legislation, provincial legislation that protects students' rights to set up a GSA in their school regardless of what board they're in. And yet the system has that much power to shut those students down and not allow it to happen. So those are just some examples. And of course the government, as a state, the public sector, there's a lot of work to be done, particularly when it comes to trans issues. There's very limited policy with regard to that. So what often underscores and undercuts a lot of this are principles in ethics. And I begin here at an international level in terms of to what extent the gender and sexually diverse populations are recognized or not. So I start with the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, put forth in 1948, is a UN document that, although it doesn't explicitly include LGBTQIQ, because obviously in 1948 this was not something that was front of mind for a lot of them, but the latter are recognized under its sweeping approach to all human beings. So when you look at the principles in the Declaration, it does speak to all human beings, and in essence, in legal terms, it's known as having been read in. It's read into the Declaration that it's recognized there. The World Health Organization, WHO, delisted homosexuality as a mental disorder in 1993, which doesn't seem that long ago, but I was calculating last night, that's almost a quarter of a century ago now. But it took them that long, 1990, the early 90s, to finally remove that. But there are still a lot of issues with regard to diagnoses through the World Health Organization when you look at it in a detailed way. The World Professional Association for Transgender Health has put forth standards of care to assist medical practitioners working with transgender, transsexual, and gender non-conforming people. And this has served as a really important guide for those people in the medical establishment who are open to helping to address those needs. The Yogyakarta Principles on Sexual Orientation and Gender Identity, which was put out in 2007, provides international legal guidelines specific to those populations. 10 years on, as I speak, they are putting out a new edition for 2017 that puts more of an emphasis on the trans populations, and in particular, the intersex populations. And so this has helped on the international level to address the issues and needs that are put forth by these populations. Carrying on with principles and ethics in our discipline. I've listed there the major bodies from the international to our own here in Canada. Making the links to queer up social work is a complicated process that involves both a trickle-down effect and upstream approach to ensure gender and sexual diversity establishes a prominent place in social work. Although both IFSW and IASSW include sexual orientation in their respective standards, gender identity, expression, and sex characteristics are not. So oftentimes these changes happen incrementally. And although, again, sexual orientation is there, we still have to make movement when it comes to the trans issues. as well as intersex. As I speak to that next, similarly, CASW and CASWE both include sexual orientation but are inconsistent with regard to gender identity and expression and devoid of sex characteristics, sex characteristics speaking to the intersex. Such principles and ethics can be extended to other social service and healthcare professions, such as physicians, nurses, psychiatrists, psychologists, counselors, psychotherapists, etc. So it's not just us, but there has to be a lot of systemic change that still needs to be put in place when it comes to recognition and understanding of these populations and what our needs are. So I return a little bit to my arguments in terms of the theory development work that I'm doing. And here I separate out to some extent the difference between legal justice and social justice. And I don't want to draw a fine line between these because there is a lot of overlap. And, I wouldn't even try to argue that they are completely separate. But I think we do need to separate them out to help understand how one tries to assist us in making progress and yet at the same time causes us to fall backwards. And that's in particular legal justice. So I'll try to explain this a bit. This slide contrasts various means of pursuing an anti-discrimination agenda for the gender and sexually diverse that can be applied to social services, our social welfare state, and any other initiatives affecting our communities. In the left-hand column, a limited approach is outlined in which the pursuit of legal justice is inevitably leads to equality to those standards determined by heterosexual people, resulting in assimilation to heterosexual lifestyles. By contrast, the column on the right illustrates a more progressive approach that seeks social justice beyond the confines of the law towards equity, allowing for our specified needs leading to liberation in which we live the lives we choose to live. So in essence, social justice is far more broad than legal justice is. Specific to the gender and sexually diverse movement, formal human rights have come via legal justice, premised on the argument of equality within a conservatizing legal sector. The problem with equality is that it elevates an oppressed group, in this case the gender and sexually diverse, to the same level as mainstream society. This can result in a form of acceptance or respectability, and both are in half quotes, towards assimilation. Although queer liberationists see legal justice as a means to an end, it is not the end in and of itself. And that's something that is key because it's one of the reasons why many of us who consider ourselves liberationists bristle at queer theory. Because one of the critiques of the work of liberationists is that we sought legal rights, that we became a rights-based, rights claims kind of movement. But liberationists never saw it as an endpoint. It was a means to getting to the endpoint of social justice. And it seems like queer theory missed that point, and it's frustrating. Anyway, it's spurred me to create a whole new theory as a result. Social justice seeks to transform society towards celebrating diversity and providing for freedoms that respect differences. Okay. And so in pointing this out, this has caused a bit of a rift and a divide within the movement itself, because I argue that the majority of the movement has gone down the left column path of seeking human rights and rights claims, and it has left and marginalized a lot of people in the process who can't access those rights or enjoy those rights to the same degree because we consider ourselves that much more different, or we are different because of the color of our skin, or because we have a disability, or because of our gender or gender identity. They become even further marginalized. There's a curtailment that happens because of the conservatizing effect of legal rights. So why in social work should we care about this? What are the actual needs of members of these communities? And on this slide, I provide a non-conclusive list by all means, but merely some examples for how minority stress experienced by these populations can lead to numerous social service needs. what is meant by minority stress that was put forward by Mayer back in the 1990s, if not 80s. It was that far back. And I can't remember, someone spoke to this briefly yesterday, it could have been Charmaine. And that is that when minorities are treated differently or mistreated by the mainstream population, they are at higher risk for health and social problems due to their stigmatization, discrimination, marginalization, and oppression for being a minority. This particular form of critical analysis counters a pathologization of the gender and sexually diverse, and it was something that the social work discipline had to shift from 1970s and earlier, and especially in the 1980s, moving away from pathologizing these communities to understanding that there are systemic pressures that are placed on us for being a minority group, and as such, we may present with a lot more healthcare and social service issues as a result. So a little commentary about Canada's 150th, because I thought I had to make a connection to the theme of the conference, which wasn't difficult for me to do because I was asked to be on a panel at my university last month where we did a celebration of Canada's 150th, and this panel was on queer issues, and all of us as panelists were critical thinkers, and we ripped into it. So to some extent, I'm doing that here with what I'm pointing out, even though, not to say I am a proud Canadian, I love this country, but I do believe as a critical thinker we could be doing better than we are, as wonderful as we are. So within Canada's 150-year history, the gender and sexually diverse have been developing a growing presence over the past 75 years or so. And I count 75 years because at that time, there wasn't a formalized movement, but there were individuals, some very courageous individuals who allowed themselves to step forward and fight the system despite what they were accused of and the whole bit from way back then. On a formal level, the gender and sexually diverse movement over the past 45 years, and that's again from the late 60s, early 70s, has fought for and achieved a number of legal and social rights. Yet what has been pursued by the mainstream segments of the gender and sexually diverse movement and seized by the federal government is a mainstreamed assimilationist form of acceptance and respect towards the composition of a homonationalist narrative, positioning Canada as an exceptional country for its inclusion of the gender and sexually diverse. Homonationalism, for those of you who may not recognize that term, it tends to be a politicized term in more of the political science kind of literature and social movements literature. It speaks to when a nation state, in this case Canada, will hold up a particular group, usually a minoritized group, and say, we have conferred rights to this group, we accept them, isn't it wonderful, aren't we a wonderful country because we're nice to these people, right? And that's a way of homonationalizing, homo being, in particular the gender and sexually diverse groups. Internationally, Israel has been highly criticized for this in terms of how they portray the LGBT populations in their country, despite what they're doing to the LGBT populations in Palestine. All right, and that's where the term first came about. But it became apparent that Israel is not alone. Even a country like Canada engages in this kind of behavior. Okay, so that's what is meant by homonationalism. So this is a form of neoliberal depoliticization that further marginalizes queer liberationists for homonationalist purposes. And so a very quick example of this, which I'm kicking myself for because I meant to bring it with me, but Canada Post put out a postcard to celebrate Canada's 150th anniversary, and it's actually a series of postcards, and one of the postcards has this bright rainbow flag on the one side, and it chooses to highlight a moment of progress in our country's history, and that is the legalization of same-sex marriage in Canada in 2005. And if you flip it on the back, it gives a whole description of what transpired then. Of course, it glosses over, and it doesn't even mention that there was a debate in this country, and a pretty vicious debate about it. And it just celebrates that we have this, and it's something that so-called proves that Canada is accepting. Whereas, I'm going to be really quick about this because I'm going on a bit of a tangent, A lot of people are not aware that there was a split in our community about whether to support same-sex marriage or not, and that split has continued to this day, and the mainstream media has not reported that much on it. And as a liberationist, I did not support it then. I still don't support it. I spoke out against it. And what I'm getting at here is a lot of us question the institution of marriage and why we prioritize or why we privilege one kind of relationship over others. Because there's a number of legal and social benefits that are ascribed to that institution, and that kind of relationship that other relationships don't get to enjoy. And in this country, it's mostly social benefits and the actual legal benefits because we have common law relationships here. So that's a critique that has been glossed over, people don't want to look at, and yet here's Canada holding this up as if we are an accepting country without realizing that that process further marginalizes people who don't fit into that, again, heteronormative type of relationship. So that's my little rant on Canada's 150. Happy birthday, Canada. So moving from Canada to back to the international arena. I did some research, a couple of research projects. One I was on a team with Charmaine on called Envisioning LGBT Global Human Rights. And another was looking at, these were kind of linked because there were overlapping themes where the principal investigator of that study, Nancy Niffel from York University, asked me to be on that team because of my other work at looking at the representation and legitimization of LGBT people in policy and treaties at the United Nations. I'm going to reference Charmaine one more time because yesterday in her presentation she mentioned about a downer moment in our presentation. This is my downer slide. And I think the next one might be a downer one as well. That when you're a critical thinker, you have to kind of go into the depths of things and the not so nice stuff. And things are not so good for us internationally. And I think that goes without saying. And especially in this moment of time, where populism seems to be a wave that's just running across the globe, spurred on by Trump south of the border and happening in numerous other nation states as well. There are numerous human rights violations being perpetrated against the LGBTQSIQ communities. This includes extrajudicial killings, torture and ill treatment, sexual assault and rape, invasions of privacy, arbitrary detention, denial of employment, and education opportunities. Three major arguments utilized by international nation states in their opposition to the gender and sexually diverse populations and our efforts at gaining recognition and legitimization at the United Nations include family values usually driven by traditional culture and sometimes religion. And these are some very harsh arguments put forward by nation states on this front. A politicized sense of nationalism, again, where populism runs through this, as exercised through sovereignty, where member states of the United Nations will give their deputations and state very clearly, we are our own nation and you don't tell us what to do, right? That real sense of sovereignty, even though they're members of the United Nations. And discriminatory legislation as implemented through criminalization. The findings of this research study reveal that although LGBTQSIQ people have made a number of significant gains at the UN, their struggle for recognition and legitimization continues to be stymied by these arguments. And that's what was revealed from the research that there was these three streams of arguments. As you can see, from the slide here, many countries continue to criminalize people based on their sexual orientation or gender identity or expression. And we are still at 12 nation states that impose, or parts of those states that impose the death penalty with regard to same-sex acts. And you probably heard in the news, or if you are, depending on where you are online, there's some really disturbing stuff coming out of Chechnya, for example, and in certain places that things are really, really quite horrendous right now. So before I leave this downer slide, I want to lift our spirits a little bit and speak to one of the great experiences I had in doing this research was something that went beyond my interviews with these international policymakers, and the activists who do this work. And it was just observation. It wasn't the interviews, it was the observations of the incredible courage, tenacity, and bravery of LGBT, 2SIQ identified activists that come from some of the most hostile nation states, made their way to Geneva in Switzerland or New York City in the US to present themselves before the United Nations and state what was really going on in their countries, which took an enormous amount of courage because not only is it an incredibly intimidating place because it's so formalized, but it's also the reality that people don't think of is that they're also facing their opposers from the nation state who are also there and giving their reports. And they have these activists to then stand up and contradict them with what their realities are, knowing that they then have to go home and potentially face them back home, right? So I owe a lot to those activists. I learned an incredible amount from them, and I think we owe it to them that the UN has finally, over the last, I would say, 10 to 15 years, started to recognize these populations through the High Commissioner for Human Rights, for example. Less so UN Women just started to focus on this. ECOSOC is another area that's done a lot of work in that area. And the refugees body there. So if it wasn't for them coming together as an international coalition, standing up for that, we wouldn't have this level of recognition. Critical social work and social justice. Social work as a leading profession within social services is well positioned to argue and advocate for the recognition, respect, and support of these populations within the social welfare sector and beyond. The points on the slide represent some arguments that can be utilized to this end. And depending on where we're positioned as social workers, whether we're doing localized social work, whether we're doing meso-level social work within our particular province or territory, whether we're doing national social work or international social work. Given that the gender and sexually diverse experience of prejudice, discrimination, marginalization, and oppression, social work has a responsibility to address this, regardless of what level we're working at. One of the best arguments that came out of the High Commissioner for Human Rights at the United Nations came forward with when nation states tried to claim sovereignty and the right to treat its own people as they choose. One of their counter-arguments was that if you are sanctioning violence against these particular populations, the gender and sexually diverse, then in essence you are condoning violence. Because they were up there arguing. This is our right to treat them this way if we choose to. And so then they were put on the spot. Oh, are we condoning violence? How do we justify that? Right? It does not benefit all of society if a segment of that society is suffering. I think we know that as social workers, and we need to impress that upon policymakers. LGBT, 2SIQs are related or friends of many heterosexuals who are also negatively affected by society's prejudice towards that. And we often don't look at the stressors and the tensions that exist in those more outer circles and how others are affected by this as well. And that has a ripple effect within society. And so from here, I look at some of the strategies for change in social work, and I've highlighted 4 major areas in which our discipline is involved. Research plays an important role in exploring and discovering ways that social work can improve upon itself. A recognition of these populations in policy can represent the structural foundation from which to advocate for and create a social work approach that effectively addresses the needs of the gender and sexually diverse, both subjectively and systemically. And this is in some ways a return to the structural social work approach. Training via social work education prepares future social workers to take on their independent professional responsibilities ethically and with integrity. On this front, I mean, when my co-editor and I Susan Hillock from Trent University, worked on the book Queer and Social Work Education. I remember how frustrated she was. She really believed, quite naively, that she could go out there and get numbers around where we were at in Canada when it came to addressing gender and sexual diversity issues in the education system of social work. So she called CSWE and asked for statistics. Can you tell me how many courses exist across the country? Can you tell me how many queer profs there are? Can you tell me how many queer students there are? And it was no response for all of them. I mean, meaning not no response. It's like, we don't have those stats. And I said, Susan, did you actually think that they existed? I mean, you know? And so that speaks volumes to the fact that we don't even ask the questions. We don't even go there. We don't even try to look at this. So there's a lot of work that we need to do. Now, we're encouraged that courses do exist. There's some level of integration of these issues within social work courses and programs. But we really need to be cognizant of being more inclusive when it comes to that. Practice that extends social work to all populations, including those who are gender and sexually diverse, makes for a more comprehensive contribution and relevant role by and for social workers. And this is important. We often hear this from students who, especially when they're in their last year, whether it's undergrad or graduate level, and about to go off and into practice, they're worried, they're panicked that they're not ready, and not feeling prepared enough to face the realities out there. And oftentimes they themselves will say, I don't know enough about this population and I'm not getting much from this program. And I think we need to be responsive to that. Even with all the progress that we've made in this country, and we've made a fair amount of progress, especially when you compare us to many other countries when it comes to these populations, we're still faced with a lot of continuing challenges. This includes human rights legislation, equity policies. Even though that we have these in place, that does not mean that we are necessarily treated the same by all others. Gender and sexual diversity are but one of many social locations that unfortunately compete for attention. As a result, a number of challenges persist in the continued work of addressing these populations and their welfare needs. So, for example, in education, should there be specialized courses regarding the gender and sexually diverse, or should these issues be integrated through the curriculum? Two different models. I'm not saying one answer is right over the other, but it's something that we need to think about and something that we grapple with in programs that are already really tight with so many courses, and there isn't a lot of room for more electives, given the core courses that we have, those kinds of realities. In policy, how can policy, which tends to be directed at the general public, address the specific needs of these populations? Right? And these populations can be really broken down. You can talk about sexual orientation or policy that relates to sexual orientation, but it's not necessarily going to address the gender identity and expression policies that need to be put in place. So, and especially when you're talking about minoritized groups, that doesn't affect the general population. Funding, should funding be limited to STIs, again, sexually transmitted infections, such as HIV/AIDS, or broadened to include other LGBTQ2SIQ issues? Something that we need to think about, because in the policy world, in the funding world, HIV/AIDS dominates. It's really hard to get money outside of that. And this despite where we are today, that illness, which is now seen as a chronic manageable illness. It's not nearly as threatening as it was years ago, and yet a lot of work went into getting the government's attention on this when they weren't paying attention at the moment of crisis. And so from a critical perspective, there's a lot of critique out there around the industry, the AIDS industry that has been developed, and how many are hanging on to it and not wanting to let it go. Meanwhile, we know there are many other issues, as you saw in my earlier slide, that affect our communities that can be getting funding as well. And social services. Should service provision be specialized with regard to these populations, or should mainstream services be sensitized to include these populations within them? Again, that difference. Specialized services you can find and usually exist in major urban centers such as Toronto, Vancouver, Montreal. But the further you get out from those major urban centers, you're going to be really hard-pressed to find services that are specified, unless, again, they're ASOs, meaning aid service organizations. And what does that say to someone who's coming out and trying to make a connection, that they have to walk into an illness-based agency that's focused on a disease, right? So there's some real issues there. Is there the funding to create these specialized services in such small, say, rural settings? Oftentimes there isn't. And so one then needs to look at the model of integrating this in mainstream services, but that, again, requires the training of workers to be able to respond to this. So we do have our challenges, for sure, in doing this kind of work and making sure that these populations are recognized. There's also ongoing social justice work. So to conclude, I'm going to outline 3 principles on which we can base our position regarding social justice work with these populations, not only in the field of social work, but any discipline for that matter. Over the past century, LGBTQSIQs have fought for and increasingly gained recognition as a distinct population that contributes to society's diversity. This is a position, political position I hold, and think it needs to be a principled one, that we don't lose sight of that. That this recognition needs to persist in Canada and be seen as a contribution to our diversity. Slowly, the major pillars of society, for example, government, law, medicine, religion, have begun to understand and embrace this. I'm not saying that there's a full embracing by all these sectors, but there's a beginning process at play there, and that needs to continue. If we are to respect the dignity and self-worth of all members of society, the gender and sexually diverse must be included, and social work must play a crucial role in bringing that about. And we do have a position in our society, but we have a voice, and we could be bringing this forth in a lot more powerful way. Whether that's through the CASW or CSWE or our localized professional associations, there is a way that we can try to promote this more. So that concludes my talk. I have my contact information here if anyone wants to be in touch with me beyond the discussion and questions. Thank you for your attention.